Hello, everyone. I'm Christine Blazinski from Informa Pharma Intelligence, and I wanted to thank you for coming to this webinar. For the third consecutive year, I've looked at clinical trials that completed during the prior calendar year. While trial starts reveal what a company or sponsor intends for development, trial completions look at just how those sponsors fared with their plans. Certainly, a certain number of trials never complete due to terminations, and I'll touch on that at the end. I've consistently looked at statistics around completed trials to assess the landscape in terms of those therapeutic areas that enjoyed the largest numbers of completed trials, same for diseases and for companies, and I've looked at their successes in terms of hitting primary outcome or endpoints. And new this year, I'm going to touch on some of the strategies that companies have employed. I want to encourage all of you to submit questions. With the WorkCast Studio platform, your questions will remain anonymous. I encourage you to do so. I love to answer questions, and if I don't get to answer your question, I've been promised that they'll be emailed to me, and I will individually respond. So thank you very much. This is the agenda. I've more or less covered that in my introduction, but just to remind you, we will be looking at landscapes, trial successes, a new piece on company sponsor strategy, and finally terminated trials. So to get started, I based this analysis on industry-sponsored clinical trials found in Informa Pharma Intelligence Trialtrove. Some of you might better know it as Citeline's Trialtrove. These were trials with an end date between January 1st and December 31st of last year. Just to remind those of you who use Trialtrove and those of you who are not familiar with it, we define the end date as when a trial completes, is expected to complete, or that primary endpoints have been reported. I pulled this data set on February 13th, 2017. So, looking at the highest level of the landscape, there were 3,420 trials that constituted my data set. What you see here are the trial counts for 2016 completed trials versus 2015 completed trials across the therapeutic areas that are covered by Trialtrove. The first two columns on the left show the relative ranking by therapeutic area, and they're more or less the same across all therapeutic areas, with the exception of a flip-flop between autoimmune, inflammatory, and CNS for this year, for the most recent year. I want to remind everyone that drug development is a very risky business, and for as many as 10,000 discovery candidates that enter the funnel or the programs, you may end up with a mere one compound that gains regulatory approval, is launched, and hopefully is reimbursed. There's a lot of attrition, and you can see that a good deal of that attrition happens during clinical development, as shown by the phase 1, 2, and 3 parts of the funnel. Looking across clinical trials that completed over the last 10 years, you see that the data mimics that funnel metaphor, with more phase 1 than phase 2 trials and more phase 2 trials than phase 3 trials. So what's the shape of the completed trial data for last year? And this slide shows that data. And you can see that for the most part, there are many more phase 1 trials that have completed than there are phase 2 and phase 3. So you can see the various therapeutic areas in Trialtrove, and the stacked bars represent the absolute numbers of trials by particular phase. And you'll see that amongst this data set, there were a significant numbers of the mixed phase, or as my colleague Doro Shin likes to say, the hybrid trials. So for the most part, if you look at oncology, you'll see that it fits the funnel metaphor, more phase 1 than phase 2 than phase 3, and it's logical to expect that. But there are instances in this completed trial snapshot where it doesn't fit the funnel metaphor. For example, in autoimmune, there were more phase 3 than phase 2 trials. The same for cardiovascular. It prompted me to go back and look at my data set on 2015 clinical trial completions, and I found that that was also the case, and it involved even more therapeutic areas. What were the top diseases whose trials completed over the past 3 years? Here you see them by absolute numbers of clinical trials that were completed. I did not include unspecified solid tumors in this ranking. The lion's share of those were phase 1 trials. But you see the top 5 diseases haven't changed over the past 3 years in the data sets that were pulled for completed trials. Type 2 diabetes stays on top and really is quite prolific in terms of completed clinical trials. The other diseases, while they remain in the top group, there is some movement. In particular, you can see that the respiratory infections rose from rank 4 to rank 3 to rank 2 over the past 3 years. What about the top 5? What about the top sponsors? Again, the cast of characters has remained identical, and Novartis remains the leader with the largest numbers of completed trials. Roche comes in second. It moved up a rank compared to last year, and Merck fell to 5th rank compared to last year's 2nd place, but it enjoys the same place that it held in 2014. I'm going to shift gears now and look at trial success. And the definition of trial success is those trials that hit primary endpoint. And by way of information, the experienced Citeline analysts scour the public domain looking for any reference to clinical trial results. And based on what they find and their analysis of those results, they assign a trial outcome tag. And so if that trial clearly demonstrates that it hit a primary endpoint, they tag it with that successful tag. So here is that landscape, and you can see that there were 3,420 trials altogether. 999 of them gained that positive outcome primary endpoint met tag from the Citeline analysts. That's a relatively large percentage of these trials, a good 30%. And for a data set that was pulled on February 13th, it indicates a very high level of industry reporting of clinical trial results. So hearkening back to the title of the white paper and the webinar, I really have to give industry a good score because trial reporting can really take time. It takes time to analyze the results, time to write the manuscripts, time to deal with reviewers' comments, and the publication process in total can take long months to sometimes several years. In terms of clinical trials that and successes with diseases, here you see a table that lists the diseases that enjoyed the most success, those that hit primary endpoint. And what I've circled here are those diseases that saw the largest numbers of trial completions that hit endpoint. Type 2 diabetes came in first with a total of 52 of these, 30 of them in phase 3, followed by breast cancer and non-small cell lung cancer. The far right column shows the relative success percentage. And so what that shows is, for example, in breast cancer, that 51 of the trials hit endpoint, but compared or relative to all of the breast cancer trials that completed, the success percentage was just under 43%. And so I've plotted these or tabled these and sorted for that relative success. So you see that colorectal cancer came in first, followed by breast and non-small cell lung cancer. And in fact, cancer indications enjoyed a large degree of success. What about the companies or the sponsors who completed trials in the past 3 years? And what I show here is that Novartis had the largest absolute numbers of successful trials, but when looked at as a percentage, but when looked at as a percentage of their total trials completed, they enjoyed a 35% success rate. This rate is by no means the highest. By volume, Roche ranked in second place, followed by GlaxoSmithKline, Johnson & Johnson, with Merck and Pfizer tied for fifth place. Novo Nordisk led with the success metric, having 46 of their completed trials hit primary endpoint. But in terms of absolute trials or absolute completed trials, the company ranked 17th place. So it is important when making comparisons that you settle on a metric to use. And my metric for most of the rest of my analysis really is on the relative success rate. Now I'm going to do a deep dive into those therapeutic areas that enjoyed the largest numbers of clinical trials completing. And you can remember that the rank order was oncology, autoimmune, inflammation, and then CNS. So, taking that deep dive into oncology, you can see that by volume, Novartis and Roche completed the largest numbers of clinical trials, hitting endpoint. Across this therapeutic area, 38.9% of the trials hit primary endpoint. Remember, across the entire data set, it was just under 30% success. So oncology did very, very well in 2016. And remember that this data set was pulled on February 13th. 6 of the companies fared better than the average, and the yellow rectangle illustrates those companies. Again, you need to think about your metric. I'm using percentage success rate, and what's notable is that even though Roche, with its 91 completed trials hitting endpoint, and Novartis with its 76 trials, when you look at it in relative to the total numbers of trials, they fell below the therapeutic area average. In terms of the top cancer indications hitting endpoint, here you see plotted stacked bars for each of the top diseases: breast cancer, non-small cell lung cancer, colorectal cancer, etc., etc. Normalized to all completed trials in this indication, breast cancer enjoyed a 43% relative success. Remember again that the therapeutic area average was just under 39%. So you had many of these diseases doing better than average, with the exception of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So the take-home messages from this oncology deep dive, again, Pick your metric. Trial volume does not necessarily mean the largest degree of success. The therapeutic area average for success was just under 39%. The sponsors with the highest numbers of completed trials were different from the cast of characters who held the top 5 spaces in terms of relative success. Colorectal cancer ranked 3rd in terms of completed trials, but it led all diseases with a 48% relative success rate. There were 51 completed breast cancer trials, first place by absolute numbers, but 43% success. The sponsors with the highest numbers of trials were Roche and Novartis, but in terms of success, Johnson & Johnson completed 20 trials, ranking 12th place, but 13 of those 20 trials hit primary endpoint for a 65% success rate, well over 15% higher than the therapeutic area average. In the autoimmune therapeutic area, what we see is across this area, AstraZeneca and GlaxoSmithKline completed the largest numbers of trials, and they also had the largest numbers of trials that hit primary endpoints, 13 trials each for these two companies. Across this therapeutic area, just shy of 30% hit primary endpoint, so it equaled the success rate for the whole data set. In this therapeutic area, however, there were a larger number of company sponsors who did better than that therapeutic area average, 9 actually compared to the 6 that we saw for oncology. And you see that AbbVie and Johnson & Johnson enjoyed a large measure of relative success. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that one of the players enjoying this high level of success is the co-sponsor duo of Regeneron and Sanofi. So they completed a total of 13 trials, 5 of which enjoyed success. What were the top diseases in terms of absolute numbers of trials that hit primary endpoint? Here you see them as COPD, asthma, rheumatoid arthritis, and psoriasis. However, when you look at their relative success rate, each and every one of these falls below the therapeutic area average, which is very, very interesting. So which diseases saw that higher than average success? Allergic rhinitis had 17 of its 42 trials hit endpoint for a 40.5% success rate. Osteoarthritis had 18 of 57 trials at 35.3%, and other inflammatory arthritises had a 40.4% success rate with 11 of its 27 trials hitting primary endpoint. When I do the deep dive through this therapeutic area, here's the take-home message, and that is that the success rate was lower than we saw for cancer. It was equal to the success rate across all of the data set. GSK and Novartis both had 13 trials that met primary endpoint, followed by AbbVie with 10. But when I look at things through the lens of relative success, the leaders were AbbVie, J&J, that co-sponsor team of Regeneron and Sanofi, Teva and Vertex tied at 4th, and then Lilly at 5th. While COPD trials accounted for the largest numbers, in terms of success, we didn't see a disease that came in with the top numbers of trials, but I did note that allergic rhinitis and other inflammatory arthritises were well above the therapeutic area average. AbbVie had 10 trials that hit endpoint with nearly a 60% success rate. That's 30% above the therapeutic area average. AbbVie did very, very well in this therapeutic area. So, what about CNS and its deep dive? What you see here is, again, there are a large number of sponsors who did better than that therapeutic area average of 23.4%. By far the lowest of our three high-performing therapeutic areas, well below the average of the entire data set. It's not surprising. I think we're all familiar with the travails that have hit this area in both psychiatric and neurologic clinical research. There's been a lot of failure, and in fact, a lot of companies have either exited or shrunk their research commitment to this therapeutic area. The top two companies with the numbers of trials hitting primary endpoint were Novartis and Otsuka. They came in with the same numbers. But when looking at percent success, AbbVie and Johnson & Johnson led, with AbbVie beating the I do apologize. The top leader is Teva. Teva had 71.4% of its trials hit primary endpoint, 3 times the therapeutic area success rate. What's also important to note is that we had another duo, co-sponsored duo of Lundbeck and Otsuka, and Lundbeck sponsored an additional 9 trials, and when you add that into the mix, their individual success rate dropped below 30%. In terms of those successful CNS diseases, here you can see that nociceptive pain finished with just under 35 trials attaining primary endpoint. It had a 32% relative success rate, well above the therapeutic area average. Multiple sclerosis and schizophrenia both came in over that therapeutic area average, but Alzheimer's failed to meet or match or exceed that therapeutic area average. It's not surprising. I think we're all familiar of the strong will among industry as well as patient organizations to do research in this area, but it has been fraught with failures. So the summary is the overall success rate in CNS trailed the other 2 therapeutic areas. Teva completed 22 trials, and over 71% of those hit primary endpoint. Nociceptive pain had 33 trials that met endpoint and had a 32% success rate. However, ADHD and autism completed a relatively small number of trials, but their relative success rates were very, very high, 45 and 40% respectively. This is a little bit of a different analysis than I've done in the past, and really it was the data that I saw in this deep dive analysis that I did that prompted me to go back and to look at whether or not co-sponsored trials are making a difference. We had that Regeneron-Sanofi duo and the Lundbeck-Otsuka duo. We saw they enjoyed a large degree of relative success in terms of hitting primary endpoint. So I wanted to take a look at that. So there were 3,420 trials that hit primary endpoint that were in the data set. Across the 3 therapeutic areas that I did the deep dive in, there were 2,004 trials. Of those trials, 187 had greater than one industry sponsor. 87 of those trials met primary endpoint, giving a 46.5% success rate, well over the data set average, well over each of the therapeutic area averages. I'm not going to show you that data. I'm going to summarize it for you in each of the therapeutic areas. Oncology had 98 trials that had 2 or more industry co-sponsors. And by the way, across my data set, I had a significant number of trials that had 3 industry sponsors, as well as a couple trials with 4 industry sponsors and 1 trial that had 5 industry co-sponsors. So in oncology, 47 of the 98 trials hit primary endpoint for a 48% overall success rate, just about 10% higher than the therapeutic area average. 23 of those trials were in phase 2 or phase 3, so you can see more success was earlier stage. Some of that was those hybrid trials. 8 of these trials involved Amgen in collaboration with 1 or 2 other partners. In autoimmune, 51 trials had 2 or more industry co-sponsors. 27 of them hit primary endpoint. That's a 66% success rate, much higher than the therapeutic area average. Sanofi, Novartis, Boehringer, Ingelheim, and Shionogi each were involved in trials that involved 1 or more industry sponsors. CNS had 46 co-sponsored trials. 16 had endpoint for a success rate of 35%. Again, far better than the therapeutic area average. Lundbeck and Otsuka clearly liked working with one another. They co-sponsored 11 trials, 5 hit endpoint. So I would say from this data that clearly co-sponsors trials were positively correlated with trial success. You can look at the data differently. You can flip it. And so what I show here are across the 3 therapeutic areas and the individual therapeutic areas, and the count of trials where the Citeline analysts tag those as having failed to meet a primary endpoint. And so for those trials that had more than one sponsor across all 3 therapeutic areas, only 17 of them had this negative trial outcome tag. In oncology, only 12 of 74. In autoimmune, only 4 of 39. And in CNS, there were only 6 of 42. So I would argue that co-sponsorship is also negatively correlated to a negative outcome. I'm going to shift gears now and talk to you about the latest analysis that I've done. I certainly have never done this. I haven't known of anyone at Informa to do this analysis, and I'm not sure that it's been done elsewhere in the business. And what I'm going to do is make the argument to you that you can use granular clinical trial data to discern what a company's drug development strategy is. And I'm going to look at that drug development strategy through the lens of a company's life cycle strategy. And before I start, I would like to offer up to you what my definition is of life cycle strategy. To me, it means the plan and strategy to prolong the revenue-earning life of a therapy. A company's ultimate goal is to identify a novel target and address that with a new therapy. Being first in class and first to market positions the company to grab market share from the disease domain. Label expansion can take the form of advancing a line of therapy, say in cancer, expanding into another disease, such as moving from rheumatoid arthritis into psoriatic arthritis, or gaining approval in new countries. Follow-on therapies are those that have the same target or mechanism of action as that first in class, but try to and are forced then to try to prove to try to demonstrate, improved safety or efficacy, compliance, etc. Finally, once a drug has expanded geographically and into multiple diseases, and its patent and market exclusivity is close to running out, it may find additional uses in combination with another drug, or its formulation may be changed to prolong its therapeutic window, improve efficacy, or perhaps compliance. So, I gave you my operating framework in order to discuss with you what I did with the data set that I had pulled from Trialtrove. And I did some work. And because of that work, I think that I can spin a tale around strategy. What I did was to take the primary study drug that was exported from my Trialtrove export. First of all, I verified that it was indeed the primary study drug. And then I looked at that study drug to see what its status was at the time that the trial was initiated. And so if it was a novel drug, I applied that. And by novel, I mean that at that time that the trial initiated, it was the furthest ahead of any of its peers identified by mechanism of action or molecular target. And in many cases, it would be the only one or first in class at the time. And that, so I just did it based on the landscape and its ranking. The Me Too was a little bit more work. I had to create that landscape and then see where the particular drug stood in terms of its status of development in the countries involved in the trial at the time of study initiation. I applied the label expansion label based on whether the study drug was approved in a market beyond those countries in the trial at the time when the trial was initiated, and if the disease or focus or use or line of therapy was not included in the drug label, or if another patient population was being studied, perhaps pediatric. Biosimilar label was applied to biosimilar candidates. Generic and OTC tags were just given to those compounds, really not important, very small numbers. For marketed drugs combined with either a novel or other approved drug, and that combination was not yet approved by a regulatory body in one of the countries involved in the trial at the time the trial started, I applied the new combination tag. And I used the same criteria to tag for new delivery or new formulation. So it was work, but I had some nice tools at my fingertips, namely other services that are in the Informa Pharma Intelligence portfolio. And here you can see for marketed drugs, I could look at well-documented histories of approvals by company, and disease and country found in a pharma projects drug record. I could also look at the very nice reports generated by our Biomed Tracker service, disease, drug combinations, and you can get a very nice timeline. And without these tools, also MedTrack, I would not have been able to do this analysis. Oh, I wish we could automate it. All right, so what's the story? Here you see what the data look like in terms of the strategy study drug tags that I applied across all of the cancer trials. And you can see that well over 200 trials were tagged with that label expansion tag. It's not that surprising. It's standard strategy in oncology to try to study a drug's efficacy in multiple types of cancer. It's, in fact, pretty much state of the art when a developer comes in with a rare or orphan drug indication and then looks to expand its market share across other diseases. Across autoimmune and inflammation, the largest numbers of trials had that novel tag followed by label expansion and then Me Too. And for CNS completed trials, the Me Too tag was the most prevalent tag in the data set. Again, that's not that surprising. If you think about it, the Me Too's have relatively lower risk. That mechanism of action or target has been already demonstrated to have an acceptable safety profile. So it's a relatively safe strategy for companies to pursue in this therapeutic area that doesn't enjoy much success these days. What I think is really, really interesting is when I put the data together, and you can see how there are the different strategies by the therapeutic areas. So on the far left, you see the oncology tag trials, in the middle, autoimmune, and to the right, CNS. The relative order of the tags is identical in the way that I've plotted the data, and I've done that to demonstrate the very differing strategies across these three therapeutic areas. It's also possible to look at the data in a different way, and all I've done is take that autoimmune data here, and I'm showing you the results of those strategy tags by the phase of the phase of the completed trials. And you can see that there are nearly 100 trials involving novel therapies in phase 2. It's very, very evident. Expanding disease or geographic labels may be waning based on the phase 2 trial completions. Here you only see 22 of them. Does that mean, we've got quite a few in phase 3, but does that mean that we're seeing the end of the Me Too's moving forward in this space? Is it going to make room for these novel therapies? Certainly, despite having that large number of novel therapy trials complete, there's going to be attrition. But this picture does suggest the possibility of new drugs entering into phase 3 and perhaps moving forward for regulatory approval, and that these novel drugs may be challenging the current leading therapies. There are nearly 30 Me Too phase 2 trials that completed. Likely they'll enter phase 3. Likely they'll be successful. So there may be some relief in terms of pricing, but bad news for the market leaders. In phase 3, there are fewer novel therapy trials, lots more label expansion trials. It doesn't look like, from a market access and reimbursement perspective, that there's going to be relief, at least for the payers. I'm starting to run out of time, so I'm going to skip the next slide and move forward to an analysis where I combined the success tag that the Citeline analysts apply with my drug strategy tags. And so what I'm showing here is an analysis for those trials that had both the tag that they hit primary endpoint and involved novel study drugs. And you can see that Novartis had 12 trials that had both of these tags, and 6 were in phase 2 and 6 were in phase 3. Johnson & Johnson came in with the next largest numbers of trials, 9, followed by AstraZeneca and then GlaxoSmithKline. I did want to point out that there were a large number of co-sponsored trials that met these 2-tag criteria here. What about the label expansion tag and trial success? Well, the relative numbers were far larger in this data set, and you can see that Roche led the pack with 20 trials that had both of these labels. There were 14 in Phase 2 and 6 in Phase 3. Novartis followed in second place, with Pfizer and Amgen tied for third, AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson. Pfizer and Amgen for second, AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson for third. Notable in this particular graph is the lack of co-sponsored trials, but they did exist. There were 26 label expansion studies that also hit Endpoint, whereas there were 25 with the novel study drugs. Another analysis that I did, and I've done in years past, is to look at biomarkers and to ask how effective were they or weren't they. But in this year, I actually did it in a different way, and I tried to also combine that with these study drug labels. And in order to look at that, because I was saying then I needed 3 kinds of labels on my trials, and what would the data sets be? And you can see that there just weren't a large enough number of trials in CNS. There was a respectable number in autoimmune, but by far the largest numbers of trials that I had to work with were in oncology, and so that's where I put my focus. This is a busy slide, and I need to walk you through that. It has a lot of information. So in the upper left panel, that shows the data for all oncology trials, Phase 2 through Phase 3/4. I've shown the distribution of those trials based on the outcome tag. So you see in the far left, those with negative outcome, those where the outcome is indeterminate, those where the outcome is not known, and those where the outcome was positive. In the far right panel, you see the same data, but it's limited to those trials that had the novel study drug tag. And in the bottom panel, that is the data for those trials that had the label expansion strategy drug tag. I think if you look in each graph in the far right, you'll see that trials involving biomarkers, if you look across the data set, enjoyed a large degree of success, well over 50%. And I've just pulled out of here the trial counts for those trials that had a PGX tag. So PGX is a pharmacogenomics. That these are biomarkers used to pre-select or stratify patients. They're often used in personalized medicine trials, immune oncology trials, and then you see the study tag for efficacy. Those are trials that involve some biomarker that is used to assess efficacy. It could be some kind of biological measurement. It could be a activity, a biometric measurement, something like that. These tags are not mutually exclusive. Many of the trials in Trialtrove have been tagged by our analysts with multiple of our biomarker tags. When you go over to the novel drugs, in the right-hand panel, you'll see that biomarkers really showed biomarker tag trials really showed a high level of success, well over 50%. And the same is true for the label expansion trials, again, well over 50%. If you look at the negative outcome trials, you can see that there were far fewer of these. However, biomarker tag trials enjoyed a higher percentage of these, but the numbers still were relatively low. One of the reasons I pulled out the PGX data from this is that there have been a lot of studies published studies that show that patient stratification really does lead to a high level of success. This is snapshot data. I had expected to see higher positive outcomes with these, and so I went back and I looked across the past 5 years of completed trial data. I couldn't possibly tag those trials for the study drug strategy, but in general, over the past 5 years, the percentage of trials with positive outcomes was 43.3%. It's pretty good. For trials that involved any kind of biomarker, that success rate rose to 47.7%. For PGX biomarker trials, the success rate was just under 50%. So clearly, the pharmacogenomic patient stratification biomarker, that strategy in a study is leading to success. I promised to cover trial terminations. I did do an analysis on those this year. 603 trials were terminated in 2016. In 2015, there were 459 trials that were terminated. However, in last year's trial terminations, only 13 of the trials were terminated due to early positive outcome. So I really looked more deeply at the trials that were terminated for reasons other than success, and there are just a few points I'd like to make about that, and that is that 72% of these trials that were terminated were done at phase 2 or earlier. So industry really is killing early, killing fast. They get a really high grade for that. By far, the largest numbers of trials were terminated at phase 2, and that accounted for 39% of all the terminations. Phase 3 terminations accounted for 24% of the trials. The rationale for terminating the trials that was most prevalent was due to a business decision. Business decisions encompass a large number of reasons: pipeline reprioritization or disease strategy shift, funding reprioritization. Those are typical kinds of business decisions. When looking at the sponsor level, at those that had 20 or more terminated trials, you see that, again, those are the top pharma who had them. They also enjoyed the largest numbers of completed trials. For the most part, business decision was the most prevalent cause of termination. But Novartis and Roche's rationale for stopping trials didn't have business decision as the top reason. It was actually poor or slow enrollment were their top reasons. So hopefully I've convinced you that clinical trials that have completed are really very useful for landscape analysis, and that details of those trials can also be used to discern strategies that companies are using across therapeutic areas and across diseases for their clinical development programs. That really is the end. I would be happy to entertain questions, and I'm going to go down and see what's been noted by my colleague Patricia Riley, who has been looking at the questions as they've come in. And I see that there is a question from one of the attendees, and it says, perhaps the paradigm of excluding phase 1 trials, specifically in immune oncology, where some are very large, leading to pivotal studies or registration. I think what the attendee is asking is, should I go back and consider those phase 1 trials? And I would argue that it might be worthwhile to do that for the mixed phase trials, the phase 1/2. Those tend to be the larger trials, but it certainly is an interesting question, and certainly for next year, if I repeat this analysis, and hopefully if we have a way to automatically tag the study drug strategy, I'd be happy to do that analysis. But thank you. It's a really interesting point, and I certainly will take it under consideration. Here's a question from an attendee who wants to know are the reasons for trial termination easily available within Trialtrove, or are they in some other Informa databases? Those are very easy to find in the Trialtrove database. There is actually a search field called trial outcomes, and in there are a list of the choices for termination reasons that you can use to build your search. That search is available both in the legacy Trialtrove interface as well as our newly launched state-of-the-art Citeline and Trialtrove interfaces. I have another question. Are there any differences in success rates by countries and region? Any differences in success rates in academic co-sponsored trials? I did not look at success rate by countries. That would be easier done when they are single site or single country trials. I could go back and do that. It's a little bit harder to do that by global trials. To pull that data apart really would take some sophisticated data analysis. So I don't know the answer to that. As far as success rates in academic co-sponsored trials, I didn't look at that. I actually do have that as a tag that I applied to my data set, just as I did for creating a new column for the strategy label. I did some things around sponsorships. A lot of the industry-sponsored trials are co-sponsored by academia. I can consider going back and doing that. I have a sense that probably it doesn't make a difference, or perhaps they might be slightly less successful. And how do pharmas assess and prioritize therapeutic areas? My data don't really speak to that. I certainly hope that they would look at my analysis and maybe consider doing something similar in order to assess those. Whether or not they do that, I can't really answer that question. Let's see. It appears that there were relatively few biosimilar trials that completed last year. Yet we are hearing that there is phenomenal growth in this area. Why the apparent disconnect? It's a great question. There were indeed only 24 trials that involved biosimilars that completed last year. And actually, I'm really lucky because my colleague Doro just asked me to read her upcoming white paper on trial starts. There actually are 189 ongoing biosimilar trials, and 35 of those trials are in rheumatoid arthritis. When I look, I'm actually cheating right now, but I look at the trial predictions, the trial predictions for when those trials might complete. It looks like a lot of them are supposed to complete this year. So I think that what we'll see next year in the analysis is a much larger numbers of biosimilar trials completing. Here's a question. It's interesting. What was the rationale behind not including terminated trials in the success rate calculation? Success rates seem inflated given that so many trials were suspended for reasons other than early positive outcome. if I was going to compare apples to apples over the past 2 years of analysis, that was how we did it. I always have considered terminated trials as different from the completed trials. Certainly, I wouldn't be able to assign a success outcome to those. They're only tagged for terminated. Only the ones that succeed are done for success. 603 out of 3,420 trials. Certainly that would bring the success rate down below 30%, but I do think that the way I did the analysis really was a fair way to do it. But I'm happy to have a difference of opinion with that. Let's see. There are a number of questions that are coming in where people want to know if the recording and the slides will be available. This session is being recorded, and I know that that link for the recording, which shows the slides, will be made available to anyone who registered for this webinar. I have a question asking about the type of Citeline and Trialtrove subscription that allows users to pull this kind of information. I pulled this information directly from Trialtrove. I didn't pull it from the back of the database. I didn't use any tricks or things. What I did was I took that full timing export out of Citeline's Trialtrove, and then I manipulated the data in terms of applying the study drug, in terms of doing industry sponsor counts, and really separating out which were the industry sponsors from the other types of sponsors. I also coded the data for those types of sponsors. I can go back and do an analysis on that. If I get motivated, this was a lot of work. So you can do it. It does take a lot of work to get to the level of analysis that I did. So, I put my analyst hat on as well as my head of innovation hat for Pharma Intelligence. Would you mind to tell us how to search label extension trials in Trialtrove? There is no easy way to do that. As I said, it was a lot of work. There's a quick and dirty way to do that, and you can use when you do a search for drugs in Trialtrove, or there is a search option to search for unapproved drugs versus drugs that have already been approved in Trialtrove. For many of those will be the label expansion trials that you'll find. So it won't be as rigorously correct as in my analysis, but I think it will be good enough for most people's purposes. And I think that looks like the end of it. We're just about at 11 o'clock. I really, really appreciate everybody attending the webinar. Thank you so much for submitting your questions. If I haven't gotten to them, I will follow up personally by email to address your questions. So I'd like to say goodbye and have a wonderful weekend.